It's more complicated than liberal against conservative. I think Putin has weaponized a certain degree of anti-woke sentiment among Russians. And some of that anti-woke doctrine, let's say, which is more conservative, he may also believe. But minimally, he's managed to use it very effectively on the propaganda front. And that's certainly one of the factors that's driving the war and sustaining it and causing it. China. I have two minds about China. I think the Chinese government is, to call it reprehensible, barely scratches the surface. China translated my maps of meaning. I shouldn't have allowed it, but the first book I wrote, is a very thick book. It's about 400 pages of dense text in English. And I think the Chinese translation was that thick, 3/8 inch and pretty big type. I have no idea what it says, but the probability that it says anything like what I wrote is pretty damn low. And China's social credit system, which we are rushing to imitate, just like we imitated the totalitarian response to COVID, that's a major threat to long-term freedom in every sense of the word. That's a dreadful fascist intervention, and I say fascist because it involves the union of the state and media and the technocratic apparatus, and that's definitely a huge threat to us.
I had to ask Jordan Peterson for his analysis on the war in Ukraine. His response was as grave as it was startling. That's the world's most famous psychologist, who began by asking for his view on Vladimir Putin as a man.
Well, he's a lot more like everybody else than anyone thinks. You know, the notion that he's Hitler or Stalin, that's just foolish. I don't see any evidence for that at all. I mean, first of all, Hitler and Stalin were very singular types, and there's a bit of Hitler and Stalin in everyone. Well, the most, what would you say, the wisest commentators on totalitarian states, like Solzhenitsyn, and many psychological commentators, Jung was a good example of that, made a very straightforward case that you can't have a totalitarian state unless every single person is willing to lie about everything all the time. And you can think about that as top down, because the leaders lie too. And they also enforce punishments if you don't lie. But then you can also think about it. The totalitarian spirit is replicated at every level of the society. And so in a truly totalitarian state, husbands lie to their wives and parents lie to their children. And the totalitarian state is actually the grip of the lie. And so, and people will certainly go along with that. China has devolved in many ways on the political front over the last 5 or 6 years. We were hoping that integrating China into the Western economy would produce a certain liberalization on their part, and to some degree that's happened. And certainly that's addressed the problem of poverty in China, which was a very good thing, but the Chinese are not our allies, and we're very foolish in the West to allow ourselves to become fractured. I think it's a catastrophe that we didn't integrate Russia into NATO when we had the opportunity, because we had the opportunity and we squandered it. And that was a big mistake, and God only knows what we're going to pay for that. I'm very nervous about the fall because the food front looks dismal, and the best projections I've encountered suggest that 150 million people will be hungry by the fall, and that'll mean mass migration into Europe, minimum, apart from the deaths, which fall particularly heavily on children in all likelihood. So yeah, we've got a mess on our hands. There's the People's Republic of China. That's a different country, like seriously a different country, right? Different tradition, different language. How many people died in China under Mao? No one knows. Same issue with the Soviet Union, although Mao was a bigger monster than Stalin, and that's impressive, you know, because there's Hitler, there's Stalin, and there's Mao. And of the three, Mao was probably the worst. He's still revered in China. Maybe that accounts for their affinity for North Korea, which could still destroy us all, the remnants of that horrible state. Maybe 100 million people died in China during the Great Leap Forward. That's a hell of a leap forward. Well, maybe it wasn't 100 million, you know, maybe it was only 40 million. But as I said before, when you're counting in the tens of millions, your point's already made. And then there was Cambodia and the killing fields, and Bulgaria and East Germany and Romania and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, that's North Korea, and Vietnam and Ethiopia, Hungary, etc., etc., etc. I don't know what the preconditions for peace might be, but I do know that naive notions that the Russians are going to lose somehow, or that we're going to win, I just don't understand. I don't understand that. Well, what do you mean we're going to win? What are we going to win here exactly? It's like we accomplished our objective. We devastated Ukraine and we kept it out of the hands of the West. And that's not great. It's not what we had hoped for, but it's better than the alternative. And I think they would buy that. And I think when Putin went into Ukraine, I thought a bunch of things, which I made a YouTube video about that. People criticized like mad. I thought, okay, well, what's happening here? Oh, I see. His end game for failure is that Ukraine is left in a smoking ruin. Oh, that's a victory. So then he can lose with impunity. So how can we win? We can't win against Vladimir Putin anyways, because you cannot win against someone you cannot say no to. Period. What's happening is that I think because of the disproportionate effect of a tiny minority of people, probably amplified by social media, the acceptable political landscape, I guess they call that the Overton window, has shifted tremendously to the left. So for example, in Canada, this is also a policy issue. The Liberals are farther left than the Socialists were 10 years ago in terms of their policies and their pronouncements. And so that's left a lot of people who would have been on the center now uncomfortably straddling the divide between liberal and conservative. And you definitely see that reflected in people like Russell Brand and Bill Maher. Brand has got a pretty vicious libertarian streak, and that mitigates against some of his more leftist ideas. And Maher just seems to be waking up finally